Hey, it's been a while since I've seen you last. Today, we want to focus on the League of Nations and the early years of the League of Nations and looking at some of the function that this league served and also how this is going to lead into other topics and other issues in this interwar time period. So we've been talking about the interwar time period, but now we're definitely in it. We've ended World War One and sort of some of the treaties and organizations that came from World War One. All right. So first thing first, when we talk about World War One, we know that one of the points in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the last one was the creation of the League of Nations. And so the main purpose of the League of Nations was this new organization for keeping peace in the world. All right. Um, so they sort of organized it under the covenant of the League of Nations. And if there was any argument, predicament, or any quarreling between members of the League, then first we'll sort of talk about our disputes, all right, and differences instead of going to war. And you had the League's Assembly, which met once a year, which each country had one vote. And we'll look at some of the structure, we see here collective security. All right, so if one state was attacked, the member states of the League would act together, collectively, and this was in an attempt to restrain the aggressor. And this doesn't necessarily mean going to war or fighting. It could be posing economic sanctions, which is restricting trade, perhaps, with the other nation. All right, or it can mean militarily, where we're going to send troops to enforce certain codes or laws or um, uphold certain settlement agreements. All right. Now, also international cooperation, and so many examples of this that were set up with the league were to solve economic and social problems. Okay. Now, these economic or social problems, could be in the field of health, education, drugs, slavery, and refugees. So the league served so many different purposes. It wasn't just to maintain collective security and establish peace, but also to help to solve some of other social ills. All right, and we sort of see that throughout the 1920s, and we'll come back to a few of those a little bit later. All right. Um, Moving on. At the beginning in 1920, there were 42 member states, and by 1926, Germany was admitted in 55. All right, and once again, the structure, the General Assembly, it met annually, contained representatives of all member states. Each had one vote. They sort of decided general policy, revised treaty, financing the league. But one of the key provisions that all votes made coming from the league had to be unanimous. So, of course, we can see some potential limitations with that, as each country is sort of going to have their own interests in mind. Okay. There was the council, which was a much smaller body and met more often, at least 3 times a year. They had 4 permanent members. That was Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. And there were 4 other members that were elected by the assembly for a period of 3 years. So they sort of have rotating memberships with the other 4. All right. And the non-permanent members were increased to 9 as more countries joined this league. All right. And they met in the instance of discussing any emergency situations. All right. One of the elements of this League of Nations was a permanent court of international justice. All right, with 15 judges, and they were of different nationalities. They handled the legal disputes between states, not necessarily political ones, but any legal issues. All right, of course, the secretariat or some other functions of the league, successes of the league, which is talked about the Permanent Court of International Justice, but there was also the refugee organization, and these were the thousands of prisoners of war that were in Russia and other places that were part of refugees. Now they really necessarily didn't have a home per se, because remember we the Treaty of Versailles redrew a lot of the political borders and created new territories. And then, of course, this was the health organization came from the League of Nations, which was trying to solve any kind of health epidemics um, and combating certain diseases in Russia and other places. And rest. All right. Now, the council, of course, would recommend what effective military strategy or um, sanction will be used, naval or air force. All right. Now, one of the things the Treaty of Versailles offered those three tips to keep the peace: quarreling between states. First, we would sort of come to the table, some sort of conference to talk about the differences instead of going to war. Um, and they would take place in the League's Assembly, which is in Geneva. All right. Now, the second part, if a member was attacked, all other members would go to its help. That whole idea of collective security, sort of going to come together, be bound together. All right. And also the commissions to oversee certain functions following these regulations. And I told you there were several commissions that were set up. One was the Disarmament Committee, all right, and this was the one to sort of reduce the amount of arms that a country sort of had, all right. So these member countries would cut back on weapons, and because that was one of the reasons that led to World War I. All of the militarism and building weapons and stockpiling weapons. So now this armament commission um, is sort of going to try to persuade members to cut back on the number of weapons. And of course, the mandates commissions, which of course Germany lost all of its colonies, and Turkey, they were really upset that they lost a lot of their colonies and provisions, and they put all of the colonial possessions from these two countries under what we call mandates or temporary rule by basically Britain and France, and they would serve. There would be these mandates, and these mandates would sort of help them to recover and establish some sort of independence and self-government. And once they were able to operate on their own, these mandates would sort of become their own country. All right, so that's sort of what the mandate system was. All right, so of course the United States did not join the League of Nations, and we're going to look at this when you come to class. Um, Many Americans, they did support the league. However, there were opponents that argued, for this whole isolationism. And we're going to look at, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was like a staunch opponent of Woodrow Wilson. And basically, the gist of it is they did not want to get involved in political situations in Europe. All right. Many felt that the league would commit the United States to this organization, and it would ultimately not allow the United States to defend its own interests because it would be bound to the terms of the league. Talk about the unanimous decision. It can't really act on certain situations without, approval. All right. Now, so America sort of was still economically interdependent on other countries in the league and the world, and so they still were very active and had specific a specific role within the league. Now, this left Britain and France as the major world powers to effectively deal with the establishment and the function of the league. All right. So, of course, the British government, they did see the league as a useful tool for pursuing some foreign policy objectives, but they did not necessarily embrace this whole idea of the league. Um, and they sort of considered themselves as now, since the U.S. didn't join us, the sole police power to make sure that the league functions effectively. The British anticipated that the United States would help secure France and ensure European peace. They were once again in this alone. All right. And they really did not want to have this position in the world by themselves. All right. Now, the French saw the League primarily as a tool which could help protect France, of course, from any potential future German attack, and as an instrument to international goodwill. Now, they both favored this sort of having a strong national defense, making sure that you're able to protect yourselves and your country is self-sufficient militarily. And they didn't see any difference between that and the whole idea of collective security. Now, of course, there were two big nations that were not allowed to join the League. That was Russia. Russia was not allowed to join the League of Nations. And in 1917, because remember, they sort of had the revolution in the communist government, the Bolsheviks came to power. And this, of course, generated fear because it went against the ideologies of the West. All right, and this whole self-determination and democracy, as was outlined in the 14 points, and as we see through the settlements, peace settlements. All right, and of course, the Russian royal family, the Romanovs, were murdered. So once again, the League was established to uphold democracy and justice, and they didn't really condone that, and many did not want to deal with Russia. How and on the same hand, the Soviets or Russia, they condemned the League. And they thought it was a capitalist club that was dominated by imperial powers. All right. Now, of course, when the League was formed, it was seen as a club of victors. All right. Clearly, the Big Four, or even just Russia, excuse me, Great Britain and France, um, they were designed to further the interests of the major allies. All right. And of course, Germany was not allowed to join the League because they took sole responsibility for the outbreak of the war, and of course, were not allowed to join this League right away. All right. So, and we're going to look at this a little bit later, but the Rapallo Treaty was signed on Easter Sunday in 1922 by both Germany and the USSR. Prior to this, there was a conference in Genoa, all right, and this conference basically was sort of to ease any French and German hostility about the Germans threatening not to pay any more of the reparations because the economy was in ruins. And France, of course, was still holding to that strong view that Germany must pay, and if they don't pay, then we're going to make sure we get our money in some shape or form. And so basically, the Genoa Conference there was no kind of settlement reached there. And it caused Germany and the Soviet Union to sort of be like the odd man out. And they went and started a new, some sort of other negotiation, the Rapallo Treaty. All right, and they signed this on Easter Sunday in 1922, and it denounced the provisions of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Remember, that's what the treaty that Russia signed to get out of the war, and to stop German advance into Russia. All right, so they signed that with Russia, and now there was a full diplomatic relations resumed. Um, Reparation claims between the two sides were canceled, and they could cooperate to keep Poland weak. Now, one note about Poland: Poland was relatively new. Poland, separate state of Poland, did not exist until after 1919, after the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, where the Poles sort of got their own land. Now, one of the key things about the Pole is that they had a strait to the Baltic Sea, this Polish corridor. So, of course, the Russians had interest because part of the land for Russia was taken, and then Austria-Hungary and Germany to create this Poland. So they wanted to keep Poland weak, and the USSR and Germany as a buffer for any future attack from the West. Now, also with this treaty, the Germans were allowed to build factories, manufacture airplanes and ammunition, which enabled them to get around that whole Versailles disarmament. All right, remember they couldn't have so many weapons, and they had to reduce their military as part of the Treaty of Versailles. So now they're going to build these factories, use Russia to build their weapons and to build their military up. And German officers were trained in Russia in the new use of forbidden weapons, and the Russians supplied Germany with grain. All right. Now, of course, this treaty is going to alarm the world powers. All right. The provisions of this treaty are going to be the first blow, so to speak, to this League of Nations. All right. And so to what it actually stands for. Russia wasn't a member of the League. All right. And this building arms and ammunition in Russia, well, that was the way Germany got around all of the provisions of that treaty. And there you see the Rapallo Treaty where the two state leaders are meeting. And that's the gist of this whole League of Nations in its early years, gang. All right.